Okay, I'm Mr. L, and these are your political science lecture notes on public opinion and political socialization. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, or however that reaches you. I'm taping here at home, so hope you don't mind the different scenery. So in a democracy, the ability of the people to freely express their opinions is fundamental. Americans can express their opinions in many different ways. They can write letters to newspapers, you can express your ideas on some online forum, you can organize politically, of course you can vote, you can respond to public opinion polls. Public opinion clearly plays an important role, not just in our political system, but in just about any sort of democratic political system. Now, in 2008, President George W. Bush and members of Congress from both parties showed that they knew how important political public opinion really can be. Not only was 2008 an election year, it was also a year in which the nation's economy experienced a serious slowdown. A crisis in the housing market led to an almost unprecedented increase in home foreclosures. Financial institutions that had invested in mortgages lost hundreds of billions of dollars. Voters naturally wanted the government to do something about this economy, about this crisis. Fixing the housing market was going to be a difficult fix, though. Just what should the government do? Giving away money was a much easier fix. So at the beginning of 2008, Congress and the Bush administration quickly forged a deal to rush income tax rebates of $600 to $1,200 to most tax filers by early spring. Now, there's no doubt that public opinion can be very powerful. Political scientists often point to two presidential decisions to illustrate this power. The first occurred in 1968, when President Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for re-election because of the intense negative public opinion surrounding the public reaction to the war in Vietnam. In 1974, President Richard Nixon resigned in the wake of a scandal when it became obvious that public opinion no longer supported him and that Congress would impeach him with the loss of the public's confidence. The extent to which public opinion supports a certain policy is very far-changing. If political leaders adopt a position, is it because they are responding to public opinions, or is it because of their own views on an issue? And in addition to that, to some extent, political leaders themselves shape public opinion. Now, for this and for many different reasons, scholars must deal with many uncertainties when analyzing the impact of public opinion on policy making. And that's what we're going to do, is try to understand how public opinion changes the policies that government makes. But before we can do that, we kind of have to define public opinion, and then we kind of have to understand how we gauge what it is at any given time. So there's no single public opinion at any given time, because there are a lot of different types of, say, quote, publics. In a nation of more than 315 million people, there could be any number of innumerable opinions on any single issue. What do we describe as the distribution of opinions among members of the public about a particular question is how we would define public opinion. Let me say that again. What we describe as the distribution of opinions among the members of the public about a particular question. Okay? So another way to describe that, define public opinion, would be the aggregate of individual attitudes or beliefs shared by some portion of the adult population. Now, typically, public opinion is distributed among several different positions, and the distribution of opinion can tell us how divided the public is on an issue and whether compromise is actually possible. When a poll shows that a large proportion of Americans appear to express the same view on an issue, then we say a consensus exists. At least at that moment in time that the snapshot was taken of that poll. Now, issues on which the public hold widely different attitudes, we would call those divided opinions. Now, sometimes a poll shows a distribution of opinion indicating that most Americans have either no information about the issue or that they're just not interested enough to formulate a position, and that often happens in students that I deal with. Politicians may believe that the public's lack of knowledge about an issue gives them a lot more room to maneuver, or they may be wary of taking an action for fear that the public opinion may crystallize against that action after they've taken it. Now, an interesting question arises as to when private opinion becomes public opinion. Now, everyone probably has a private opinion about the competence of a president, as well as private opinions about more personal concerns, such as the state of your neighbor's lawn, or whether or not the person behind you is cheating. Now, we say that private opinions become public opinion when the opinion is publicly expressed and concerns public issues. When someone's private opinion becomes so strong that the individual is willing to go to the polls to vote for or against a candidate or an issue, or is willing to participate in a demonstration, discuss the issue at work or school, speak out on television or radio, participate in the political process of any of a dozen other ways, then that's when their private opinions become public opinion. Now, most Americans are willing to express opinions on political issues when they're asked about them. How do you formulate these opinions and attitudes? Well, typically, views that are expressed as political opinions are acquired through the process of political socialization. By this, we mean that you acquire political beliefs and values, often through party identification, through relationships with your family, friends, co-workers, and so forth. Now, the most important early sources of political socialization are found in the family and in the schools. Individual basic political orientations are formed in the family if the family members hold fairly strong political views. When adults in a family view politics as relatively unimportant and describe themselves as independent voters or disaffected from the political system, then the children in that family receive very little political socialization and must receive it from other sources. In the last few decades, more and more sources of information about politics have become available to all Americans, and especially to young people. Although their basic outlook on the political system may be formed by early family influences, young people are now exposed to many other sources of information about issues and values. So therefore, scholars believe that this greater source of information may explain why young Americans are more liberal, typically, than their parents are on many social issues. Now, not only do our parents' political beliefs and values and actions affect our opinions, but the family also links us to other factors that affect opinions, such as race, social class, educational environment, and religious beliefs. How do parents transmit their political values then to their children? Well, studies suggest that the influence of parents is due to two factors: communication and receptivity. Parents communicate their feelings and preferences to children constantly because children have such strong need for parental approval. They are very receptive to their parents' views. They want their parents to approve of what they're doing. Children are much less likely to influence their parents because parents expect deference from their children. They don't expect to get their children's approval. It doesn't work that way. But nevertheless, other studies show that if children are exposed to political ideas at school or in the media, that they will share their ideas with their parents, giving the parents what some scholars call a second chance at political socialization. Children can also expose their parents to new sorts of media, such as internet sources or blogs or so forth, that they may not have been exposed to before. Now, from the early days of the Republic, schools were perceived to be important transmitters of political information and attitudes. Children in the primary grades learn about their country, mostly in the patriotic ways. They learn about the Pilgrims, the flag. Of course, you learned about the presidents. You learned about national holidays. And then, of course, as you moved up to middle school, children learn more historical facts. You learn about the understanding the structure of government, function of the president, judges, and Congress. And then now, by the time you got here to high school, you have at least maybe a little bit more of a complex, at least I hope you do, understanding of the political system. You might even identify with a certain political party or ideology, and you may have fairly strong positions on certain issues. Now, generally, education is fairly closely linked to political participation. The more education a person receives, the more likely that person will be interested in politics, be confident in their ability to understand the political issues, and to be an active participant in the political process itself. Public opinion polls, however, suggest that even well-educated young Americans are just not very strongly interested in politics as a whole. Individuals who join interest groups, though, based on an ethnic identity, may find, for example, some sort of common political bond through working for the group's common cause, like civil liberties or civil rights. For example, African Americans who are in activist groups may consist of individuals who join together to support certain governmental programs that will aid African Americans who are poor or the African American population as a whole. Members of a labor union may strongly influence others to support pro-labor candidates, so they tend to be more active than others. Let's look at opinions, leaders, and so people who influence others. Now, we're all influenced by people that we're closely associated to, people we hold in very high regard, either at school or family members or other relatives or even teachers, for that matter. In a sense, these people we would call opinion leaders. But on an informational level, or on a more of a, I don't want to put it, on an informal level, their influence on our political views is not necessarily intentional. They didn't go out to say, be Democratic, be Republican. We we're influenced by our formal leaders quite a bit, presidents, maybe lobbyists, congresspersons, newsmen, and sometimes religious leaders often. But those informal leaders were not, they don't really mean to influence us, but their influence is strong upon us. Our formal leaders, their interest lies in defining the political agenda in a way that that can take place on our terms and that we can understand and grasp. What's the role of the media? So clearly, when we say media, we're not just talking about newspapers and television, but radio, internet, any sort of method of communicating information from one person to another. Of course, they influence public opinion quite a bit as well. And this is because the media inform the public about issues and events. And often many people believe that the media, and probably rightly so, has an agenda-setting effect, that they are trying to influence public opinion one way or the other. In other words, to borrow from Bernard Cohen's classic statement about the media may not be successful in telling people what to think, but they are stunningly successful in telling their audience what to think about. Today, many contend that the media's influence on public opinion has grown to equal that of the family. For example, in her analysis of the role of the media in American politics, media scholar Doris Graber points out that high school students, when asked where they obtain information on where they base their attitudes, mention the mass media far more often than they mention their families, friends, or teachers. Now, this trend, combined with the increased popularity of such media sources as talk radio and television and the internet, may significantly alter the nature of the media's influence on public debate in this country. If you're interested in political science, there's a PhD dissertation research topic for you: the effect of the media on the younger generations today. How do political events, especially defining political events, how do they change our philosophies? Well, generally, older Americans tend to be somewhat more conservative than younger Americans, particularly on social issues, but also to some extent on economic issues. We call this the lifestyle effect. Some of that has to do with the fact that older Americans sometimes live through, especially the tail end of the Great Depression generation, lived through and remembers the tough times that they had, so they have a different approach to economic issues. Younger people, especially today, are much more liberal than their grandparents or great-grandparents are on social issues, such as the rights of gays and racial and gender equality. Nevertheless, a more important factor than a person's age is the impact of the political events that shape their attitudes for an entire generation. When an event produces a long-lasting effect, we're going to call that a generational or a cohort effect. And the Great Depression is a very good example of that. So if you grew up in the 1930s during the Great Depression, you were more likely to form lifelong attachments to the Democratic Party, the party of Franklin Roosevelt, the party that worked to end the Great Depression. In the 1960s, 1970s, the war in Vietnam and the Watergate break-in and the subsequent presidential cover-up fostered just widespread criticism and cynicism about government. You may not have followed any party there. That's marked at the rise of the independents. There's evidence that the years of economic prosperity under President Ronald Reagan during 1980s led a whole lot of young people to identify with the Republican Party and conservatism. but it's much less clear of whether or not more recent presidents such as Bill Clinton and George W. Bush were able to affect identification with younger voters for good or bad. We really don't have the time yet to measure that. And we certainly don't have the time yet to measure whether President Obama has motivated, say, African American voters who had never voted before, whether their voting in his elections will continue through future elections for non-African American candidates. Another major factor, and probably the best predictor of someone's voting behavior, is party identification. And if we set aside everything else we know about someone, party ID is still our best predictor of how someone's going to vote. In addition, though, there are a variety of socioeconomic and demographic factors that appear to influence political preferences. Those factors include, as we talked about earlier, education, income, socioeconomic status, religion, race, gender, geographic region, and there's even smaller traits than that. People who share the same religion, occupation, and other demographic traits are likely to influence one another and may have the same political concerns that follow from the common characteristics that they share. Other factors, such as the perception of the candidate themselves and issue preferences, are closely connected to the electoral process. Now, because of this relationship, various groups and voting behavior, campaign managers will often target large particular groups when they're creating their campaign advertising. Today, campaign managers will go even further in the attempt to sell their candidate to a certain group, and they'll micro-target, for example, Jews who are concerned about the United States' relationship with Israel, and they'll sell their candidate to that group within a group. All right, so with the possible exception of race, party ID still is our most important determiner of voting behavior in national elections. Party affiliation is influenced by family and peer groups, generational effects, media, and the voters' assessment of candidates and issues. In the middle to late 1960s, though, party attachment began to decline and greatly weaken. The number of independent voters were only a little bit more than 20% of the eligible electorate during the 1950s. They constituted 38% of the electorate by the mid-1990s, and their numbers remained at that level or even increased during the most recent years. Recent numbers put the independent number of voters or people who claim to be independent at a little bit more than 40% today. New voters are likely to identify themselves as independent voters, although they may be more ready to identify with one of the major parties by their mid-30s. And there is considerable debate among political scientists over whether those who call themselves independent are truly really independent. You know, when they're asked, a majority of them say that they're leaning toward one side or the other, one party or another. So are they really independent? Or how often do they actually still vote the same way over and over? Now, demographic influences reflect the individual's personal background and place within society. Some factors that have to do with the family into which someone is born, race and religion. They don't have a lot of choice in those matters. Others may be the result of choices that were made throughout one's life, for example, residency, education, and profession. It's also clear that those that have higher incomes and hold more professional jobs tend to vote more. Similarly, children who are born into wealthier families are far more likely to complete college than children who are born from poor families. Currently, that's just what the demographics tell us. Let's look at some of these factors a little bit more in detail. First is education. In the past, having a college education tended to be associated with voting for Republicans. In recent years, however, the correlation has become a little weaker. In particular, individuals with a postgraduate degree, more than a bachelor's, have voted predominantly Democratic. And in recent years, with the exception of the '08 and '12 elections, voters with only a high school education have cast their ballots for Republican presidential candidates much more frequently than they did in the 1960s and 1970s when voters tended to favor the Democrats. Many people with postgraduate degrees are professionals such as doctors, lawyers, and college professors. Typically, a higher degree is a requirement for the occupation. Despite the recent popularity of the Masters of Business Administration, though, most business persons are more likely to only have a bachelor's degree or no degree at all. So they're much more likely to vote Republican, the party of lower taxes and pro-business. Family income is a strong predictor of economic liberalism or conservatism. With low incomes, those people tend to favor more government action to benefit the poor or to promote economic equality. Those with high incomes tend to oppose government intervention in the economy or to only support it when it benefits business. On political issues, therefore, the traditional political spectrum that we talked about in week 1 is a useful tool here. The rich tend toward the right and the poor tend toward the left. If we examine cultural, though, as well as economic issues, however, the four-cornered ideological grid that we discussed then becomes much more important. It happens that upper-class voters are much more likely to endorse cultural liberalism, and lower-class voters are much more likely to favor cultural conservatism. Support for the right to have an abortion, for example, rises with income. It follows that libertarians, those who oppose government action on both the economic and the social issues, are concentrated among the wealthier members of the population. Those who favor government action both to promote traditional moral values and to promote economic liberalism, economic equality, cultural conservatives, are concentrated among groups that are well less off. So how about economic status in voting? Well, the normal factor here is that the higher a person's income, the more likely the person will vote Republican. Manual laborers, factory workers, and especially union members, though, are much more likely to vote Democratic. There's just no hard and fast rules for economic status, though. Some very poor individuals are just flat-out devoted Republicans, just as some extremely wealthy people support the Democratic Party. What explains this more is that they value their cultural reasons more than their economic ones. How about religious influences? Well, religion tends to motivate us pretty well, and it motivates us in the political arena as well as just about anywhere else. So let's look at some different denominations and see how they tend to vote. Now, traditionally, scholars have examined the impact of religion on political attitudes by dividing the population into categories of Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. In recent decades, though, that breakdown has become less valuable because there are certain segments within them that tend to vote different ways. It is true, for example, in the past that Jewish voters were notably much more liberal than members of other groups, both on economic and on the cultural side. And they do tend to be more liberal today. But sometimes Jewish people will vote more on the conservative side because of one issue, and that is support for the nation of Israel. Persons that report no religion are typically very liberal on social issues, but are more mixed on economic ones. Northern Protestants, and a Protestant is a non-Catholic Christian, and Catholics have grown closer to each other politically in recent years, and so have Southern Protestants and Catholics. This represents something of a pretty big change. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Northern Protestants were distinctly more likely to vote Republican, while Northern Catholics were much more likely to vote Democratic. Yet even today, in a few parts of the country, Protestants and Catholics tend to line up against each other when choosing a political party. Old habits die pretty hard, and so do old enemies. Today, two factors tend to be the major predictors of political attitudes among members of the various Christian denominations. One is the degree of religiosity, or the practice of their beliefs, and the other is whether that person holds fundamentalist or evangelical viewpoints. A high degree of religiosity is usually manifested by very frequent attendance at church services. That is, attending church at least once to twice a week. Voters who are more devout, regardless of their church affiliation, tend to vote Republican, while voters who are less devout are more than often not Democratic. What I mean by that are more than often Democratic. In 2008 presidential elections, let me give you some statistics. For example, Protestants who attended church gave 67% of their votes to the Republican candidate John McCain, compared with 54% of those who attended church less often. Among Catholics, there was a similar pattern. A majority of Catholics who attended church regularly voted Republican, while a slim majority of Catholics who were not regular church goers voted for the Democratic candidate, then Senator Barack Obama. Exit polls following the 2006 congressional elections showed the exact same pattern. A majority, 55% of those who attended church regularly once a week voted Republican, while 60% of those who attended less regularly voted Democratic. Now, there is one exception to this trend. African Americans of all religious backgrounds, regardless of how often they attend, are extremely supportive of the Democratic Party and have given their support in excess of 90%. Another distinctive group of voters are those Protestant Americans who can be identified as holding evangelical or fundamentalist beliefs. Now, actually, a majority of American Protestants can be characterized as evangelical. Not all, though, are politically conservative. Some are politically liberal, such as Democratic former presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. Fundamentalists, though, are a subset of evangelicals who believe in a number of doctrines not held by all evangelical Christians. In particular, fundamentalists believe in biblical inerrancy, which means that every word of the Bible is literally true. In politics, fundamentalists are notably more conservative than any other type of evangelical. A liberal fundamentalist is an extremely rare sight. It's like finding a unicorn. And they play an extremely important role in the Republican Party. When we get to political parties, we'll learn a little bit more about that, but we would call them the religious right, or the moral majority. How about race? What kind of role do they play? Well, although African Americans are on average somewhat conservative on certain cultural issues, such as same-sex marriage and abortion, they tend to be much more liberal than whites on social welfare matters, civil liberties, and even foreign policy. African Americans voted principally for Republicans until Democratic President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s. Since then, they have largely identified with the Democratic Party. Indeed, Democratic presidential candidates have received on average 87% of the vote from African Americans since 1956. And of course, Barack Obama's support among the African American community was overwhelming. Most Asian American groups lean Democratic, although by much narrower groups. Muslim Americans and their descendants are an interesting category, to say the least. In 2000, a majority of Muslim Americans, actually those especially Muslim Americans of Middle Eastern descent, voted for Republican George W. Bush because they shared his cultural conservatism. But beginning with the 2004 election, most of those individuals shifted Democratic because of what they perceived as threats to their civil liberties after 9/11. Of course, how about Hispanics? We need to look at the Hispanic vote. Now, the diversity among Hispanics has resulted in very differing political behaviors, so it's difficult to characterize them. It's very misleading to think that all Hispanics are simply alike because they identify themselves as Hispanic. The majority of Hispanic Americans vote Democratic. Cuban Americans, however, are usually Republican. And most Cuban Americans vote Republican because they left Cuba, which was communist, and the Republican Party is strongly anti-communist, which translates into votes for the Republican Party. Now, in 2000, Republican candidate George W. Bush received 34% of the Hispanic vote. In 2004, Bush's support reached 40%. And since his days as Texas governor, President Bush had envisioned creating a long-term Republican coalition in the Hispanic vote, similar to what Democrats had done with African Americans. And indeed, I guess it looked like he was well on his way to building that coalition within the Hispanic vote. Hispanic voters were showing considerable sympathy for the Bush platform, which was based upon religion, family values, and patriotism. But by 2006, Hispanic voters favored Democratic candidates over Republicans 73 to 26%. What happened? Why did Hispanic support for Republicans fall so dramatically and so quickly? We can sum it up in one word: immigration. In 2008, Senator Barack Obama won more than 2/3 of the Hispanic vote. Bush had favored a comprehensive immigration reform that would have granted unauthorized immigrants, or however you want to call them, illegal immigrants or undocumented workers, whatever word you want to use. He favored a plan to give them legal citizenship. Most Republicans in Congress, though, refused to support that plan. They refused to support their own president on that issue, and instead called for a very hard line against unauthorized immigration. Now, many Hispanics, while they were concerned about unauthorized immigration, they were more concerned about the harsh rhetoric that was coming from the Republicans on this issue, and that convinced many Hispanics that the Republican Party was just flat out hostile to their interests. Hence, their support went to the Democratic Party. So these different kinds of group divisions, racial issues, racial divisions, gender divisions, religious divisions, they do matter in terms of party politics. I just mentioned gender, so I guess we need to talk about that now. Let's talk about gender. Until 1980, there was very little evidence that the men and women's political attitudes were very different. It was so little evidence that we really didn't even measure it. But following Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, scholars began to detect what we called a gender gap. A May 1983 Gallup poll revealed that men were much more likely than women to approve of Reagan's job performance. The gender gap then has now reappeared in many other elections, with women being much more likely than men to support Democratic candidates. A gender gap has also been evident in many midterm or congressional elections. In 2002, 55% of women favored Democratic candidates, compared with just 43% of men. But in the 2006, the next set of midterm elections, that gender gap narrowed considerably. The same number of women, 55% from 2002, was the same in 2006. But now 50% of the men preferred Democratic candidates. So what happened to Congress? Congress switched over from Republican control to Democratic control. Women also appear to have different attitudes from men on a whole range of issues other than just who they prefer for president. They're more likely than men to oppose capital punishment or the death penalty. They're more likely to oppose the use of force. Studies have shown that women are more concerned about the risks of the environment, more supportive of social welfare, and more in agreement with extending civil rights to gays than men are. Notably, women are much more concerned than men about the security issues after 9/11. While men were concerned with what was going on outside of the country, women were more concerned about the security issues within the borders. And I guess the voting effect of that was that temporarily they voted very strongly for the Republican Party on national security issues temporarily. But the evidence of this is showing that in presidential elections since 9/11, that gender gap has been a little narrower than normal. But since 2008, it's kind of widened back out a little bit more. How about geographic region? Where you live can also influence your political attitudes. For example, the former solid Democratic South has now become the solid Republican South. Only 44% of the vote from southern states went to Barack Obama in 2012, and only 45% of it went in 2008. Now, there's a tendency today, at least in national elections, for the South, the Great Plains, and the Rocky Mountain states to favor Republicans, and the West Coast and the Northeast to favor the Democrats. But perhaps more important than region is residency, urban, suburban, or rural. People in large cities tend to be more liberal, therefore more democratic. Those who live in smaller communities tend to be more conservative and therefore more Republican. Few other things. Factors such as the perception of the candidates, that's always an important one, and issue preferences always have an effect on how people vote in certain elections. So therefore, as the candidates and the issues change, that can change our voting behavior from one party to another. If a candidate is so bad, for example, or is so dishonest, it might even not just turn us off from that candidate, but it might turn us off from that whole party as a whole. So this is why the party spends a tremendous amount of time screening their candidates. The image of the candidate is important to the voter, especially if at the presidential level. To some extent, voters' attitudes toward candidates are based on emotions, such as trust, rather than any judgment about experience. In the general election, it's about, do I feel that that person can be president? In some years, voters have been attracted to a candidate who just appeared to share their concerns. I feel your pain. In other years, voters have been attracted to a candidate who had a high level of integrity or honesty. If we're coming out of a bad scandal, it's who can you trust? Voters have been especially attracted to these candidates after scandals such as Watergate or Bill Clinton's sex scandal. Let's thinking about those issue preferences. Although personality and image may be persuasive, voters have some notion of how candidates differ on the basic issues, or at least know which candidates want to change in a certain direction. Historically, the important area here is in the economy. When the economy is doing well, it's very difficult to challenge an incumbent, especially at the presidential level. In contrast, inflation, unemployment, or high interest rates are likely to work to the disadvantage of the incumbent or the person already in the office. War and foreign policy can influence voters as well. Certainly the Bush administration's war policy in Iraq had much to do with its party's dramatic defeat in 2006 midterm congressional elections, which gave control of Congress to the Democratic Party, to its political opponents. By late 2008, however, relatively good news from Iraq tended to make the war back page news, not really the most important thing, as an election issue. But what was on the front page? The worldwide financial crisis, the housing market collapse, and of course, all of these things of, am I going to be able to pay my mortgage? Am I going to have a job tomorrow? All of those were the dominant issues. And so pocketbook issues then became the dominant issues for voters. Okay, so that explains a little bit on how people vote. So let's talk a little bit now about public opinion and how we measure it. And so here we're going to be talking about polling. Right, so in a democracy, people express their opinions through a lot of different ways, but one of the most common ways of gathering and measuring public opinion is the use of opinion polls. Now let's talk about where they came from first. During the 1800s, certain American newspapers and magazines spiced up their political coverage by doing face-to-face, what they called straw polls. And these were unofficial polls, just trying to gain a political trend. I do straw polls during election time. I count yard signs, and whoever's yard sign I find, that's the person I think who's winning the election. That's a straw poll. It has no scientific value. All right, in the early 20th century, the literary magazine Literary Digest further developed the technique of opinion polling by mailing large number of questionnaires to individuals, most of whom were its own subscribers, to determine their political opinions. And from 1916 to 1936, more than 70% of the magazine's election results were accurate, just using their own subscribers. Now, Literary Digest polling activities suffered a setback, though, in 1936, when the magazine predicted, based upon 2 million return questionnaires, that Republican candidate Alf Landon would defeat Democrat Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Landon only won 2 states. So there was a major problem with the magazine's polling technique, and that was its use of non-representative respondents. In 1936, at possibly the worst point in the Great Depression, the magazine's subscribers were considerably more well-off than the average American. Most Americans, if you were trying to feed your family, you weren't worried about your magazine subscription. In other words, they didn't accurately represent the average voter in America. Therefore, their poll results didn't accurately represent the average voter in America. Now, several newcomers to public opinion poll industry in this time accurately did predict Roosevelt's landslide victory. And these newcomers today are now are still very active and are really the founders of the scientific polling methods. These would include the Gallup poll, the Roper poll, founded by Elmo Roper. And Gallup and Roper, along with Archibald Crossie, developed the modern polling techniques of market research. Using personal interviews with small samples of selected voters, less than 2,000, they showed that they could predict with accuracy the behavior of the total voting population. Now, by the 1950s, improved methods of sampling and a whole new science of survey research had been developed. And that's what we really call this, survey research. Survey research centers sprung up throughout the United States, particularly on universities, and there are several of them here in Virginia, but the biggest ones in the nation are at Princeton, at the University of Chicago, and at the University of Michigan. Now, what kind of techniques would we use for this? Well, how can interviewing 2,000 people out of 315 million Americans give us a result to tell us what people are thinking? Clearly, it's necessary that the sample of individuals be representative of all the voters in a population. Now, consider an analogy. Let us say we have a large jar of 10,000 pennies, and they all have different dates, and we want to know how many pennies were minted between certain decades, say between 1960 to 69, 70 to 79, 80 to 89, and so on. Well, one way to estimate the distribution of the dates on the pennies without examining all 10,000 pennies is to take a representative sample. Now, this sample would be obtained by mixing the pennies up and then removing a handful of them, perhaps, let's say 100, and then seeing what the distribution of dates would be. The distribution of dates might go something as follows. Let's say we'd find 5 in the 60 to 69, 5 in the 70 to 79, 20% of them would be in the 80 to 89, 30% in the 90 to 99, and 40% from 2000 to present, as they're the newest ones. If the pennies are very well mixed within the jar, and you take a large enough sample, then the resulting distribution will probably approach the actual distribution of all of the pennies in the jar. But the most important principle in sampling or poll taking, and in this case in the pennies, would be randomness. Okay? Every penny or person should have a known chance, and especially an equal chance, of being sampled. If this happens, then a small sample should be representative of the whole population. So you have to have people from all demographic groups, age, religion, race, region, and the like, and have all different people of opinions. The ideal way to sample the voting population in the United States would be to put all the voters' names into a jar or a computer and randomly sample, say, 2,000 of them. But this is way too costly, and it's pretty inefficient. So pollsters have developed a number of other ways to obtain some real good samples. One technique is to simply choose a random selection of telephone numbers and interview the respective households. This technique produces a relatively accurate sample at a fairly low cost. Now, to ensure that the random samples include respondents from relevant segments of the population, rural, urban, northeastern, southern, so on, most survey organizations randomly choose, say, urban areas that they will consider as representative of all urban areas. Then they randomly select respondents within those areas. Now, a generally less accurate technique is then known as quota sampling. Here, survey researchers decide how many persons of a certain type they need in the survey, such as minorities, women, or farmers, and then send out interviewers to find the necessary number of these types. But not only is this less accurate, it also can be kind of biased. Because say the interviewer goes into a bad neighborhood or they don't want to go interview someone after dark, well, they may not reach every single kind of person. Or maybe the interviewer themselves is biased and they don't want to talk to a certain racial group. So quota sampling sometimes can be a little less accurate. Now, accuracy is the most important thing when we're talking about sampling, because national survey organizations take very great care to make sure that their samples reflect the average American. The Gallup and Roper polls usually interview at least 1,500 individuals, and their results have a very high probability of being correct, usually within a plus or minus of 3 points. The accuracy with the Gallup polls predicted presidential elections has been within 3.5% in every election since 1936, with the exception of 1992. Don't remember what happened in 1992 for the Gallup poll. Bad year, I guess. Everybody's allowed to miss one every once in a while. polling organizations have also had some notable successes, too, in accurately predicting the results of midterm elections. The 2006 election forecasts were mostly on the mark. The 2010 were pretty close, showing Republicans with a big gain. Indeed, pollsters were publicly ecstatic about how closely their pre-election forecasts hit the mark. In 2006, two pollsters, Mark Blumenthal and John McIntyre, took advantage of 5 polls conducted by major organizations, including the Harris, Roper, and Gallup polls, and on each of the last 5 days before the election, they took an average. And the averaged forecasts were correct for every single candidate. In addition, the average of polls had Democrats picking up 6 Senate seats, which is exactly the number that they picked up. According to Blumenthal, quote, "The reason polls continue to be reasonably well is that people who actually vote are people who take the trouble to be interviewed." And if you go on to, say, realclearpolitics.com, and if you're really interested in following some of these, especially at election time, they do this as well. They'll take all the polls and they'll combine them and give you an average, and they are very close and give you a very accurate forecast for the elections. Now, there are some problems with polling, though. Public opinion polls, though, are just a snapshot of what it is on that day, that particular time. And it's what it is to that particular question. Now, given that definition, it's fairly easy to understand situations in which the polls are wrong. For example, many public polls had Jimmy Carter leading Ronald Reagan leading up to the presidential election of 1980, but the Gallup poll didn't. Only a few analysts noted the very large number of undecided respondents a week before the election. There was this huge group of people who hadn't made their mind up. And those voters in the very last week of the election shifted massively to Reagan and he won the election and really blew Carter out. The very famous photo of Harry Truman showing the front page of the newspaper that declared his own defeat in the 1948 presidential election is another real tribute to the weakness of polling. But again, the poll that predicted his defeat was taken more than a week before the election and relied on the old model of magazine polls rather than their subscribers. That relied on their subscribers, excuse me. But Truman then won that election with 49.9% of the vote. He pretty much killed him. So there are some problems with polling. Let's look at some of these in a little bit more in detail. Polls can report erroneous results because if the pool of respondents was not chosen in a scientific manner, if the number of people sampled, if there were too many Republicans sampled, or too many Democrats sampled, or too many of a certain religious group sampled, if the group itself was too small, then you have sampling errors, which is and can cause the results to become skewed. The sample would be biased, for example, if the poll interviewed people by telephone and didn't correct for the fact that more women than men answer the phone. Okay? And that some populations, like college students and the very poor, for example, can't be found by phone very easily. Poll takers get close to election day, they become even more concerned about the quality of respondents. Some pollsters continue to interview eligible voters, meaning anyone over the age of 18 and over and who's registered to vote. But many others also use a series of questions in the poll and try to find out if they're likely to vote. So that means they're trying to get a more accurate election eve prediction. There's a big difference between whether or not, I'm registered to vote, but I'm not going to bother to go, and I'm registered to vote and I'm going to go, and if you would let me vote 10 times, I would. I would have a much bigger impact on the poll than someone who's not likely to show up. Right? When a poll changes its methods from reporting the reviews of just eligible voters to likely voters, then the results of that poll are likely to change dramatically. By the way, polls that measure just eligible voters typically favor Democrats, and registered voters typically favor Republicans. How about false predictions? Often surveys report very detailed results with percentages carried out to 1 or even 2 decimal places. For example, you may have read about 2 candidates being within, say, 3.2% of each other. But if the survey has a margin of error of plus or minus 4 points, then that difference could be 7 points apart, or they could be tied. This is not very comforting, especially if you're trying to make a prediction about who's going to win. Now, national polling organizations will take an election sample of, say, 1,500 people of likely voters or potential voters and state that the sampling error is, say, plus or minus 3% for each candidate. So what does that tell you? Well, if 2 candidates are evenly matched in the polls, it means that the final result could be as much as 47% for one and 53% for the other. So it could be a 0-0 election, tied, or it could be as much as one person winning by 6 points. So, this is not an exact science by far. What about the questions that they ask? It makes sense that the results of a poll will depend really on the quality of the questions that I ask or that any political science asks. Depending on what you ask, voters could be tricked into supporting a certain proposal or to oppose it. One of the real problems with this is the yes-no format. For example, suppose a poll said, "Do you favor or support the war in Afghanistan?" A respondent might wish to answer that they favor the war at the beginning, but not as it's currently being waged or going on. And that they favored fighting terrorism, but not a military occupation. Well, a yes-no question really doesn't give them any way of indicating their true position. But respondents are sometimes swayed by the inclusion of certain words in a question. The respondents will answer in the affirmative if the question was, "Do you favor or oppose the war in Afghanistan as a means of fighting terrorism?" Now more people are likely to say, "Yes, I favor it," because who doesn't want to fight terrorism? Everybody wants to fight terrorism. Right? So now you're going to get a much more favorable response. How a question is phrased can change the polling outcome dramatically. The Roper Polling Organization, and follow me on this is a tough one, once asked a double negative question that was very, very hard to understand, and even I don't really understand it. Quote, here comes, "Does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened?" Do you know what I just asked you? I'm not sure what I just asked you. And the survey, in the end, reported that 20% of the people who answered the survey, and all of them Americans, seemed to doubt that the Holocaust ever occurred. When the Roper Organization rephrased the question more clearly to see if people really believed in the Holocaust, the percentage dropped to less than 1%. So it really depends on how you phrase the question. Furthermore, respondents' answers are also influenced by the order in which the questions are asked. Some by the possible answers from which they're allowed to choose, and in some cases by their interaction with the interviewer. To a certain extent, people try to please the interviewer. They answer questions the way they think the interviewer wants them to be answered, not necessarily the way they really feel. They want to try to live up to the interviewer's expectations. We've got a few other issues. How about unscientific or fraudulent polls? You guys have probably all seen these when you're online. Mail-in polls, telephone call-in polls, internet polls, polls conducted by workers in a campaign are usually pretty biased. don't give an accurate picture. The truthfulness of many of these polls has to really be taken with a grain of salt. And the biggest problem with this is it makes the public wary of all polls. And that's a real problem because, when the polls are scientifically done, then they have real value. But if the public thinks their time is being wasted, then they may not answer any polls. Let's look at it. For example, a local retailer of alcoholic beverages was opposed to internet sales, so they did a landmark survey. And in that survey, they, quote, proved that millions of teenagers buy alcohol online. But what they didn't tell you was that the polling organization paid teenagers to be part of the sample, and that the sample included only internet users themselves. So not really a random survey. They gerrymandered the results to get what they wanted. Now, interesting enough, there is one method, or one unscientific method, of forecasting an election result, and it's not counting yard signs. By the way, that compares well with opinion polls. It's betting. So in some places, like in England, for example, you can bet on election results. And so if they'll accept a bet on who will win a various election contest, you have a pretty good chance of checking their odds, and their odds typically are right. And you can go out and maybe make a profit on a political election. I'm not telling you to gamble, by the way. No. This from the guy who likes to gamble on fantasy football. How about a push poll? What is a push poll? Well, a push poll is a poll in which the respondent is given misleading information about a candidate that you're opposed, someone is running against, and asking them to vote against that candidate. Now, this is a practice that's spread through all of American politics, and it's a pretty heinous practice. In 1996, in a random survey of 45 candidates, researchers found that 35 of them claimed to have been victimized in some way by negative push poll techniques used by their opponents. Even advocacy groups now are using push polling to try to persuade people to vote against certain issues or to be against them one way or the other. I'll give you some data from the 2000 campaigns. And during the 2000 presidential primaries, Republican John McCain said that the Bush campaign was making more than 200,000 advocacy calls, and these were push polls, asking voters about their likely choices. And the calls used long questions containing questions about McCain's voting record. And in essence, did you know that McCain voted 87 times to raise your taxes? That would be an example of a push polling question. McCain said he saw this as very negative push polling. The Bush campaign said that all the information that was contained in it was accurate. But they're really cherry-picking the data is what they're doing to try to portray the opposition in a very negative light. It happened, push polling has happened in every election since then. It's legal, but it's kind of shady. It was used in the 2008 and 2012 campaigns. Democrats used it ruthlessly in 2008 against John McCain again, just knowing that he himself did not approve of it, so he wasn't going to use it. It was also used widespread in campaigns for governorship and other state offices. The answers given in these are likely to be influenced, by some of the data that's given. Most of it is factually correct, but it's just used in such a way to kind of it's been cherry picked and the question or the statement is written in such a way as to make it seem like it's something that it's not. You have to be very careful with evaluating the results of push polling because the purpose of it is to turn you off to the other person. How about technology? Can we use technology to do polling? Can we use technological advances that allow polls to be taken over the internet? Well, what kind of questions? I guess we would have questions about the ability of the pollster to obtain truly random samples. But I guess the same thing was probably said about the telephone, was whether or not, how do you know you're really talking to a woman, or, or this person or that person. So, probably in the future they'll come up with a method to actually poll accurately over the internet. I think that's probably coming. We'll talk a little bit more about it here in a minute. Let's talk about telephone polling. All right, so in the 1970s, telephone polling really became the dominant form of in-person polling instead of person-to-person, simply because it was the cheapest method of polling. Additionally, telephone interviewers, they don't have to worry about safety issues going into communities, which is really important for the interviewer. And telephone interviews can be conducted fairly quickly. They can bang, 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 and go on to the next one. And they allow the politicians or the media to poll one day, and then the results. You can compile all the data and announce the results of the poll the next day, giving you really some instant feedback. But somewhat ironically, the success of television polling has created some major problems for it. So, first, the telemarketing industry in general has become so persuasive. So many people call people's houses now that nobody wants to answer these polls. You see who it is, or you look, oh, I don't recognize that number, so you don't pick it up. More than 40% of households now either use caller ID or some other form of call screening. And when I wrote these notes, that was 3 years ago, so it's probably a higher number now. Of course, this has greatly reduced the number of households that each polling organization can actually reach. So they got to call more and more people. Therefore, the calls automatically are rejected, and that person just may not choose to answer, giving the poll less validity. Plus, you get a lot of non-responses in polling. You have unreachable numbers, refusals, answering machines, call screening devices. The non-response rate has increased to as many as 80% of the actual phone calls that they're making. And such a high non-response rate undercuts the confidence in the poll. Now, in most cases, polling only 20% of those who are on the list can't lead to a random sample, so therefore you have to wonder about the validity of the results. Even more important for politicians is the fact that the polling organizations are not required to report their response rates, so you don't know if they're twisting the numbers to get what they want or what the politician wants. There's just questions about it. And then you have cell phones. Now, what's the problem here? Well, a lot of the problem with cell phones is that they're just not really included in the random digit dialing programs that these companies use, although that's changing. They're not really listed in polling directories, although President Obama in 2008 and through now has really revolutionized the digital portion, using the cell phones to gather data. Furthermore, individuals with cell phones, they could be anywhere. They might not even be in the country when you call them, thus really confounding the attempt to reach people in a certain area, so you don't know if you're getting the right demographic in person at that time. And more people, especially younger Americans, only have a cell phone and have no landline. So the polling accuracy is even further reduced because these individuals can't be included in the sample. So then that brings us back to internet polling. It's not done on a one-on-one basis because there's no voice communication. But in spite of its potential problems, one very respected poll, the Harris poll in 1998, began including an online sample with its midterm election polls. And its election predictors were very accurate in many states. Nonetheless, it did make one serious error in a southern governor's race, and the Harris Group subsequently had to refine its technique, and it does continue to do online polling, although it did minimize the factors that it gave it. Now, this organization believes that proper weighing of the results, and that's what it did, it declined the weighing part of it a little bit. will eventually achieve the equivalent of the random sample that they get through telephone polling. Public opinion experts argue that the Harris poll, though, violates the mathematical basis of random sampling. Even so, the internet population is looking more and more like the rest of America. As of 2012, almost as many women, 79%, go online as men, 81%. 67% of African Americans and 78% of Hispanics, compared with 79% of whites. But even if such organizations as the Harris Poll succeed in obtaining the equivalent of a random sample, another problem will always remain, and that's the proliferation of non-polls on the internet. Every media outlet maintains a website, allowing users to submit their opinions to the website. And numerous organizations and for-profit companies send polls to users via the internet. Mr. Poll is a good example of this, www.mrpoll.com. It bills itself as the internet's largest polling database. Mr. Poll allows you to create your own polls just for fun, and then include them on your own homepage. But in general, Mr. Poll, like many other polling sites, asks a number of questions on various issues and then seeks answers from the people who log on to them. And Mr. Poll states that none of these polls are scientific. But as people see them over and over and over again, and then they start to believe that all polls aren't scientific, then what it's doing is it's diluting the validity of the real scientific polls. Does it devalue polling? Well, certainly non-polls certainly existed. We already know that before the internet, when we talked about what polling was like in the 1800s. And the ease in which they can be conducted now of the internet is certainly accelerating. That's disturbing. They're being used indiscriminately. Many Americans may not want to be bothered by telemarketers and unwanted telephone polls. They seem to want reports of polling results, though. They want to know who's winning. They want to know what candidates are winning and which candidates are losing, who's trending up and who's trending down. But don't call me and find out my opinion. When asked, a majority of Americans say that the polling results do interest them. Yet the proliferation of polls, often on the internet, with little effort to ensure their accuracy, often results in perhaps the greatest threat to the science of polling. Now, public opinion affects the political process in a bunch of different ways. Politicians, whether in office or in the midst of a campaign, or see public opinion as important to their careers, they don't ignore it. The president, members of Congress, governors, other elected officials realize that strong support from the public, as expressed in public opinion polls, is a source of power with dealing with other politicians. It's far more difficult for a senator to say no to the president when he is immensely popular and if the polls show approval for his policies. Public opinion also helps political candidates identify the most important concerns among the people and to help them shape their campaigns, therefore, successfully. Nevertheless, surveys of public opinion are not equivalent to elections in the United States. We can't just take a poll, find out what people think, and then do it. They may influence our decisions, but elections are the major vehicle through which Americans bring about change in their government, not polling. Americans are divided into a multitude of ethnic, religious, regional, and political subgroupings. Given the diversity of American society and the wide range of opinions contained within it, how is it that the political process continues to function without being stalemated by conflict and dissension? Now, one explanation is rooted in the concept of the American political culture that we discussed last week. Our political culture is shared by Americans of many different backgrounds. To some extent, it consists of symbols such as the flag, the Statue of Liberty, the Liberty Bell, the elements of our political culture that include our shared values such as liberty, equality, property, support of individual rights, and community service. personal achievement and responsibility. The structure of government, particularly federalism, the political parties, the powers of Congress, and popular sovereignty are also important values that hold the republic together, that is the glue. The political culture provides a general environment for the support of the political system. If the people share certain beliefs about the system and a reservoir of good feelings exists toward the institutions of government, the nation will be better able to weather periods of crisis. This was certainly the case after the 2000 presidential elections, when for several weeks it was not certain who the next president was and how the determination of who that person was going to be made. I remember at some during this time, there was a host of different individuals that said the nation was facing a true constitutional crisis. Certainly in many nations, this definitely would have been the case. Soldiers would have been picking up guns and there would have been revolution. But in fact, the broad majority of Americans didn't believe this to be the case at all. In fact, polls taken at this time found that most Americans were confident in our political system to decide this issue peaceably and in a lawful manner. The political culture also helps Americans evaluate their government's performance. Political trust, the degree to which individuals express trust in political institutions, has been measured by a variety of polling questions. One of these is whether the respondent is satisfied with the way things are going in the United States. Responses to this question often depend on the events occurring within the United States at the time that the question is asked. During the presidency of Ronald Reagan, an improving economy helped satisfaction levels to rise. President George H.W. Bush between 1989 and 1993 enjoyed high levels until poor economic problems in his last year and a half and other difficulties gave Democrat Bill Clinton the presidency from 1993 to 2001. Polling suggests that Clinton's two terms were fairly largely successful. Under Republican George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009, however, satisfaction levels fell, although they were temporarily interrupted by the 9/11 attacks. They have not improved under President Obama, as almost 60% of Americans polled recently answered the above question that I mentioned in the negative. How do you feel? Are you satisfied with the way things are going in the United States? 60% said dissatisfied. A vital component of public opinion in the United States is the considerable ambivalence about which public regards many national institutions. From 1987 to 2008, opinion polls asked respondents how much confidence had they had in public institutions. Over the years, military and religious institutions ranked the highest. In recent years, though, a decline in the confidence in churches occurred following a substantial number of sex abuse allegations involving Catholic priests. During periods of war, the public's confidence in the military is strongest, but as a war rages on, that confidence begins to wane. Currently, the public's confidence in the military in Afghanistan is at its lowest point since the conflict began. The United States Supreme Court and the banking industry have done well over time, but the banking industry took a huge hit in 2008 and has never recovered the public's confidence since then. Less confidence is expressed in newspapers, television, big business, and organized labor. Current confidence in Congress is at 16%, which is better than in some polls in 2009, which had the number closer to 9%. At times, popular confidence in all institutions may rise or it may fall, reflecting optimism or pessimism about the general state of the Union. For example, a 2008 Gallup poll showed that the level of satisfaction with the state of the nation had dropped to 14%, its lowest rating since 1992. Although people may not have much confidence in government institutions, they certainly will turn to government to solve their problems and the country's major problems. Gallup polls conducted over the years between 1979 and 2008 show that the leading problems have changed over time, but the public tends to emphasize problems that are immediate, like peeing on a fire, and that have had the media's attention. When coverage of a particular issue increases suddenly, the public is more likely to see that as the most pressing problem. Thus, the fluctuations in the biggest problem may in part be attributed to media agenda setting rather than what the public really thinks. If public opinion is really important for our democracy, as policymakers are they really responsive to the needs of the public? A groundbreaking study by political scientists Benjamin Page and Robert Shapiro in the early 1990s suggested that the fact that the national government is very responsive to the public's demands for action. In looking at changes in public opinion polls over time, Page and Shapiro showed that when the public supports a policy change, the following facts occur. Policy changes in a direction consistent with the change in public opinion 43% of the time. Policy changes in a direction opposite to the change in opinion 22% of the time, and policy does not change at all 33% of the time. Page and Shapiro also showed, as should be no surprise, that when the public opinion changes dramatically, say by 20% or so, rather than like 6 or 7%, government policy is much more likely to follow the changing attitudes of the public. Although opinion polls can't give us an exact guidance on what government should do in a specific instance, the opinions measured in polls do set an informal limit on the government's action. For example, consider the highly controversial topic of abortion. Most Americans are fairly moderate on the issue. They don't approve of abortion as a means of birth control, but they do believe it should be available under certain circumstances. Yet sizable groups of people express very intense feelings both for and against legalized abortion. Given this distribution of opinion, most elected officials would try to change policy would not change policy to favor either of these extreme positions. To do so would clearly violate the beliefs of a majority of Americans. In this case, as in many others, public opinion, and this is very important, public opinion does not make public policy. Rather, it restrains officials from taking truly unpopular actions. I must say that again. Public opinion does not make public policy. Rather, it restrains officials from taking truly unpopular actions. If officials do act in the face of determined opposition, the consequences will be determined at the ballot box. Now, to what degree should public opinion influence policy making? It would appear that members of the public view this issue differently than policy leaders do. Polls indicate that whereas a majority of the public feel that public opinion should have a great deal of influence on policy, a majority of policy leaders hold the opposite position. Why would a majority of policy leaders not want to be strongly influenced by the public? Well, it may be that public opinion polls can only provide a limited amount of guidance to policymakers and are often not the only factor in their decision-making process. And when we get to Congress, we'll kind of see that. Policymakers can't always be guided by opinion polls. In the end, politicians must make their own choices, and when they do so, their choices must inevitably involve trade-offs. Politicians vote for increased spending to improve education, for example, by necessity because there are fewer resources available for other worthwhile projects. Individuals who are polled do not have to make such trade-offs when they respond to questions. Just spend more on education. Indeed, survey respondents usually are not given a choice of trade-offs in their policy opinions. Pollsters don't typically ask respondents what they want more or less spending in a particular area such as education. But rarely, though, is a dollar amount assigned. Additionally, broad policy questions often provide little guidance for policymakers. What does it mean if a majority of those polled want quote, free medical treatment for everyone in need. Obviously, medical treatment's not free. Certain individuals may receive medical care free of charge, but society as a whole is going to pay the bill. In short, polling questions usually don't reflect the cost of any particular policy choice, and policymakers know that. Moreover, to make an informed policy choice requires an understanding not only of the policy area, but also of the consequences of any given choice. Virtually no public opinion polls make sure that those polls have such information. And finally, government decisions can't be made simply by adding up all of individual desires. Politicians engage in horse trading. All politicians know that they can't satisfy